Hello, I'm Sharon Ferris, Director of Marketing at Xerox. Welcome to the webinar. Today's webinar is the last in our series of 5, where we've been exploring impressive career service models at universities and colleges across Canada. For our final hour together, we have Dr. Peter Dietsche back with us, as well as another panel of respected career service leaders, this time discussing the important theme of evaluation. Again, before we go any further, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes to share with you. If you have any questions, you can enter them in the question box on your screen. And then please let us know as well if your question is directed to any panelist in particular. Later today, we will email you copies of all the slides as well as all the recordings for each of the 5 webinars in the series. And since this will conclude our series, we'll also send you a very brief evaluation form and ask that you take just a few minutes to complete it. We also encourage you to keep engaging with this webinar on social media using these Twitter hashtags and handles that you see on your screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. First, we have Peter Dietsche, the Emeritus Davis Chair in Community College Leadership at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. And of course, Peter is the author of the impressive career service model research that we've been discussing all week. And our panelists from some of these impressive career centers are Patsy Valenzuela, Supervisor of Career Education and Employment Development at Mount Royal University, Tony Botello, the Director of Career Services and Volunteer Services at Simon Fraser University, and Felicity Morgan, the Director of the University of Toronto Mississauga Career Center. Welcome, and thanks to each of you for joining us. And now over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Sharon. Good day, everyone. Whoops, I go back to the beginning here. And so today is the final day, which is unfortunate. We've been having a lot of fun doing these webinars every day this week. And the final topic is evaluation, or maintaining and demonstrating the high quality of career services delivery. Today's session will run as the other 3 sessions have this week, with my introduction to the theme of evaluation using some relevant research results drawn from our project. Then it will go to the panelists for an introduction. Each panelist will introduce themselves and say a little bit about the evaluation theme. And then the meat of the session will be the fireside chat, where we'll try to make our way through 3 to 5 questions posed to the panelists for comment, and then finally leave about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. So the evaluation theme, interestingly, was something that came up in the survey results when we asked career services professionals across the country who responded to our online survey to rate metrics. We had 18 separate metrics that could be used potentially as an identifier of an impressive model. And the results were, as they're shown on screen, that evaluate service regularly scored the highest. It was upwards of 70% of the respondents indicated that this would be a highly useful or highly valuable metric to identify an impressive model of career services. When we asked about career center evaluation, however, we found that only 20% evaluate services regularly, 28% have evaluated once or twice, and 50% had not evaluated at all. Now, evaluation is something that, this is not unusual. My career in looking at evaluation has been such that many people miss the evaluation step when they design a new program. It takes time. It's not easy to do. However, CEREC has sponsored a publication. It's available on the CEREC website. It's called Career Center Evaluation, a Practitioner Guide, and was put together by a number of practitioners from across Canada. So we asked folks if they were aware of the guide. It's intended to be a tool to help people launch evaluation exercises within their departments. 54% were not aware of the guide. And of those, 60 who were aware of the guide, 66% they had not used it. That's unfortunate because while 32% had made some more extensive use of the guide and some had said it had some impact, when we looked at the relationship between level of use, whether it was not at all some or extensive, and level of impact, some or great impact, we found, as it says, shows down at the bottom of the slide, that the correlation between extent of use and level of impact was 0.89, which is really, really high. That's a very high correlation. So what it suggested that if people make extensive use of the guide, they find that it has a tremendous impact on their services. So that's a brief introduction to the whole issue of evaluation, or the theme of evaluation. So I'll pass it over to the panelists, beginning with Patsy at Mount Royal University, to say a little bit about herself and the theme of evaluation. Patsy?
Sure. Thanks for having us participate today. We're very excited to be part of this panel. As far as Mount Royal University, we became a university in 2009, so that definitely changed the nature of our institution and the type of evaluations and outcomes and measures that we needed to be paying attention to. In our department, Career Services, we have our general career and employment development services for all students, grads, all employers, but we're also part one department with our work experience and cooperative education program. So it's quite a large department overall. We're part of the Student Affairs and Campus Life Division. And one amazing thing that they've done over the last few years is they created a strategic plan that really aligns all the areas within the division with the outcomes that are at the divisional level and at the university level. So for us, what that meant is there's very specific outcomes that we need to be working towards in order to make our work valid, I guess, or valuable and clearly related to those outcomes. The other thing our division did is they created an assessment committee where they put resources into creating expertise, not just at the divisional level, but there's a representative from each department. So we actually have a representative in our department who is there to increase knowledge and information around assessment and evaluation. Overall, it's been a real growth experience around really learning what assessment and evaluation is, looking at our programs, looking at our outcomes, and creating that real culture of assessment. One of the things we really look at is that in the nature of the work we do, we have 15 work experience programs, and trying to create clear and consistent measures across those programs is something that we're strategically working towards. On the career education and employment development side, I've been on that team as a coordinator, employment coordinator, and a supervisor for the last 18 years. We have a lot of transactional relationships with students and employers where they come and go. So how do you really measure impact when it's transactional? So hopefully some of the examples that we can talk about today can speak to that, can speak to connecting to higher level outcomes, and can speak to connecting to measuring things when your relationships are transactional and when you have so many programs that are related to different faculties across the institution.
Thanks, Patsy. Tony.
Thank you, Peter. As mentioned, I'm with Career and Volunteer Services at Simon Fraser University, and I started my role here back in 2008. And at that time, the office, we had been doing quite a bit of, evaluation on sort of a satisfaction level with a lot of our programming and interactions. But as a group, as we looked at it, we started to question the value. We started getting a lot of, it came to that point that we'd analyzed, we spent a lot of time summarizing, writing these little mini reports. And really, at a certain point, we actually stopped looking at them in any sort of real way because it's just, okay, we got 3.6 on this or 4.2. At a certain point, some of the comments, some of the information became meaningless to us. It just became, we were collecting, but we weren't actually doing anything. So at a certain point, we stopped and sort of said, okay, we need to find a better way to sort of assess and evaluate the things we're doing. And it was one of those wonderful timing things. It was about the same time that the practitioner guide came out. And I think at CEREC and at the Connexus conference, and I think some of our other national conferences, there became a regular speakers speaking on this and other aspects of evaluation, particularly representatives from the Canadian Research Working Group on Evidence-Based Practice in Career Development, which is always one of my favorite titles to share with people. So that really for us was a turning point for us. To sort of think, okay, there's different ways we could be assessing and evaluating. We could be looking at impact. There's more variables for us to consider. And so really for us, that was that starting point, and we sort of went in both feet in, if I can use that expression. And I can't say. And it wasn't necessarily smooth, like, because we talk about our use of evaluation quite a bit. And one of the things we're very clear to say is we are far from expert in this. No one on our team was hired because of their evaluation savvy or training or background. We all had our career practitioner, and sort of suddenly along the process came this realization that, hey, we have to get better at this other side. So, fortunately, again, having that guide, having colleagues across the country who are open to share some of their experiences and techniques, and again, members of the Canadian Research Working Group who have let us get started. And I think that's a key thing for us was to actually just start, knowing that we were starting imperfectly, but starting imperfectly was better than waiting for a perfection that might never occur. And so, and over time, I think, we've tweaked and got a little bit better at it. I wouldn't say I'm still completely confident in my ability to write an outcome statement, but we're getting there. And I think that's sort of key. And I think just one little thing I was going to share with that is because of our sort of jumping into this, again, this evaluation is beyond sort of the career field. In student services and our post-secondary in general, this movement to better evaluate and assess what we do is sort of, institutional wide. And because of some of the work we've done, that actually we got recognized within our own SFU student services as a leader as well, which helped with some of that utter credibility and activity that is useful for us within our institution. So I'll stop there at this point. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're very welcome. Felicity.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, kind of a similar story to what Tony was saying. We were always evaluating, collecting these paper evaluations. And about 10 years ago, we decided that we really needed to think about how we were evaluating, what we were doing with this information. So the director before me really started to set up a bit of an infrastructure, I'd say, around how we collected the information, putting initially herself and then later one of our career counselors, and agreed, Tony, none of us are experts in assessment. We're doing the best we can and learning along the way, still lots to learn, but also putting some resources behind it. So we hired, within our complement of student staff, we hired 3 student staff as research assistants to really help us gather the information. Once we decided what we wanted to evaluate and how we were going to use it, we have some infrastructure to help us really take that information. They do a lot of analysis for us because career practitioners typically don't have time to do that. So they do some reports, some qualitative, quantitative analysis, and that really helps us to assess how we're doing, both on the kind of micro level of an individual event or service, which we can then share with our partners too if we're doing something with a partner. But then we can also look on a macro level to really combine all this information together and get a good overall sense of how our service is doing. I would say all the staff are involved in it in some way because everything is evaluated at some point, and we'll get into that a bit later, I guess. But I think it's represented a shift in culture. Because before we were just kind of going with the, oh yeah, students are relatively happy, that kind of a mindset, and now really challenging ourselves. And I think the other piece to share that I think may or may not be different from others is we're totally student fee funded, well, almost like 97% student fee funded. So we have to report back on a lot of things to our student funders, which are our student government. So the assessment evaluation has really helped us to tell our story to them and the college and the campus in general. And that also has really established credibility for us too.
Super, thanks, Felicity. So evaluation evolves over time. So one of the things that, and it's, as Tony said, it's better to begin and jump in with both feet than just to sit by. On the survey, we asked respondents, so we had 63 institutions responding to this particular question about measuring student use of service. So one of the beginning points, I guess, for evaluation is simply collecting the volume data, as I mentioned the other day, like how many people move through. And so we asked, are you collecting statistics for all services or some services or not collecting anything at all? And so you can see from the results there that most people are collecting information around service use. We also was wondering how granular was the information that they were collecting. Was it just on aggregate numbers in terms of people coming through the turnstile at the front, or were people collecting statistics for each individual service? And so you can see that the vast majority were actually collecting statistics on the use of every individual service. And as we saw a few days ago, there are huge, so it's a plethora of services being offered by career services departments across Canada. The methods to collect these statistics varied somewhat, although most of them were digitized. So it was either a standalone computer system like Clockwork or Orbis, or a student information system like DataTel or Microsoft PeopleSoft. Then, of course, website traffic statistics kind of capture themselves in most cases. So there's a variety of methodologies, but most people have digitized methodology for collecting the services. So for the first question to pose to the panelists, and I'll begin with Pat as the first respondent, is what areas of career service delivery are important to measure?
Sure. And I apologize for holding the mic just to make sure everyone can hear me. So I'll be doing that throughout the session here today. Important to measure. So I think at the highest level, speaking about this, I would look at it almost like as a stool with three different legs on it. So one of them would be any items that connect to your university's strategic outcomes, your faculty strategic outcomes, your divisional or department strategic outcomes. That way you know that what you're looking at, what you're recording, what you're taking time to measure is actually going to be valued if you roll it up. And similar to what Tony said, some items that we've collected over the years, we're not doing anything with it. So we also have stopped doing some of that data collection and really focusing on collecting data that has some type of strategic connection to it. The second piece is, I think at the university level, it's still important to measure some operational items. So traditionally, most of us, I think traditionally, that's all we do. We measure operational things. How many people came to this event? Did they like the food? Did they like the location? And we kind of get stuck in that world. So we definitely want to go beyond that. But I think there's still some accountability when you do measure certain operational items. If you say a service was valuable, but only one person participated in it, you really have to question that. And I think administration will always question that, and they should. So I think having numbers and satisfaction surveys and operational items that validate the quality of that service are still important to continue to measure. And we do have that for all of our events, workshops, the professional development that our coordinators do in class. I think the third piece that we've really looked at adding, though, is really adding participant outcomes. So on top of general operational items and making sure it's connected strategically, what are the actual outcomes for the participants involved? And they're different depending on what the activity is. So rather than being so worried about measuring everything, we're really focusing on certain outcomes depending on what the activity is. So for example, for students for workshops, we've added learning outcomes to all of our workshops. When it comes to doing a workshop in class for faculty, the participants that we're evaluating there are actually our faculty. We're not evaluating the students. They maybe didn't invite us to come in, but faculty invited us to come in. So those are the participants. When it comes to employers, another example is that we are measuring, for example, their recruitment objectives and whether those things were met. So what I think looking at this overall is that if you've got the operational pieces, the strategic pieces, and then the participant pieces, it makes what you're measuring go beyond just numbers and create a broader perspective for the people that you're sharing that information with. It's also allowed us to give better information you know, whether it's at the department level or the institutional level, we can play with the data more and report on different pieces of the data. So that's a strategy we've been trying. Again, we're not experts either, but it seemed to be quite effective over the last couple of years as we've continued to move in this direction.
Thanks, Patsy. Felicity, can you comment?
Sure, and I agree with what Patsy was saying. I think the key word that she mentioned was strategy. To be able to really think about what your institutional, divisional, and departmental goals are and gather the information that's appropriate for those. I think for us, it's very much around partnerships, trying to make sure that our partners know what we're doing and know how effective we are. And again, agree with Patsy on the outcomes idea that you really need to think about what are the key outcomes for the participants. For us, it's mainly the students that we're looking at. And seeing if we are achieving the outcomes that they need to achieve or that we all hope they will achieve. The only other group that I would mention that wasn't mentioned were the non-users. So it's maybe kind of contrary to the question, but trying to figure out, you know, what are people who are not using our services doing? And instead of using our services, or they're not using any services at all, and trying to understand why that might be. So measuring non-user feedback is also really important to us.
Super, thanks, Felicity. Tony.
Yeah, there was a lot of good stuff there on both. I'm enjoying this.
Hey, they're
again, I think I would echo much of what's been said here before. I think there is obviously a need to continue to measure volume, for lack of a better term, and usage. As sort of as foundational, but again, I think it's as been mentioned by the other folks, it's not the whole story. So I think it's about trying to fill out our story as best we can. So I think volume is still a part of it, because again, if we have these great things that 2 people see, or 1 person, in Patsy's case, can't believe it's only 1 person, then you know you have to question that. So I think there's volume, and we do that. Increasingly, what we've tried to do is actually try to separate out in our reporting the different types of activities that we do, because they're different. One-to-one is different from workshops, which is different from some of our career events, which might be different from a fair, which is, and trying to separate again, so we can see year by year differences in if there's any trends or patterns, as well as acknowledge there's different types of learning that occurs at different types of events. So that's one of the things we do. One of the things we do at this point, we're currently only doing it with our one-to-one appointments, is we can link it up to the university student information system. So again, that gives us, in addition to numbers, we can actually really break it down into faculty level, credit hours taken, international, permanent resident, etc. So we get a little bit more of that demographic information that could be useful for us in terms of, again, whether we're collaborating with partners or even just better understanding who the students are that we're seeing. And in some cases, because we've made a real push several years back to get to students earlier on, it's also a way to see if our marketing and communication is actually getting to students in 1st and 2nd year is actually working. So I think all of that is the numbers part of it. And then the other thing we'd like to do is, again, with our programming, and we do this currently with our one-to-ones and the workshops that we run, is trying to measure impact or shift in learning using some of the post-pre methodology that I think is referenced in some of the documents referred to. And I think that's been really interesting and useful for us. And in addition, again, trying to align some of our learning outcomes with some of our own stuff, typical sort of career type learning outcomes, but also look at those learning outcomes where it overlaps both with what's important from a career perspective, but also back to the institution, what's important to the institution. And a couple of the examples I'll use are concepts like agency and optimism, which are often proxies for both academic success as well as career success.
Thanks so much, Tony. So great suggestions on evaluation. I guess the 2 major areas being the operational piece, the volume measures, so-called, and then the impact measures. And that's certainly a theme that we found within our interviews, where people were talking in this, and the panel members have just mentioned this as well, that really tying your measures to the strategic plan, so you can actually in a very, very concrete way, demonstrate with your data that you're meeting the needs of the stakeholder groups on campus, which then in turn builds value. So the service is then seen as being valuable because it's contributing to the overall success of the institution. When we're looking then and moving to looking at outcomes and impact, and I say here, despite half the sample not evaluating the services, almost 2/3 indicate they were measuring outcomes impact, that doing so was very important because it came out as being the #1 metric for identifying an impressive model of career services. And then among the outcomes explored, some of the easy stuff, and then sometimes it's mandated by provincial governments that it needs to be measured, were employment rates and student satisfaction. Although, as Tony says, once you get the 4.5 out of 5 on a satisfaction scale, well, what does that really mean? So when we were doing the interviews, we noticed that more people were moving beyond satisfaction, looking at moving beyond the volume measures, the transactional how many people attended the one-on-ones or whatever, and moving much more toward outcome measures or impact measures. And so exit surveys were some of the suggestions with students and employers at career fairs, assessing student learning outcomes at workshops, and then the pre-post measures, and then the more common post-pre measures, where you have a student who engages in an experience and then reflects on that experience and assigns some metric to that experience, and then is asked to think back and say, well, what do you think? Where do you think you stood prior to having had this experience? So that's not so common in terms of usage around evaluation. Most it's pre-post, but then these days with our students we can't really use that sort of methodology. So the post-pre is very valuable, and it's again a kind of situation where I think where folks get together at Connexus, that's really a context where you can have a lot of sharing going on, because I met some folks in institutions across Canada who are doing some marvelous things around impact assessment. And so that sharing is wonderful, as is happening right now with our panelists. So I guess the question too is moving beyond satisfaction. So what are effective measures for evaluating the outcomes or impact of career services, which is a bit more of a challenge in terms of evaluation exercise. So let's start with Felicity.
Okay, sure. I think we've mentioned the importance of learning outcomes, and that is, I think, where it all starts. Actually, when you begin to plan your program, your workshop, or evaluating appointments, you're thinking about what are the learning outcomes I'm really trying to measure, because I think that is the most convincing piece when you can show movement of the student. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, of course. I think one of our favorites is having some reflective questions in evaluations. So asking students, how are they going to do something differently next time when they face the situation, or what have they learned that they're going to actually now implement? And that can be, I think, in any of the areas that we might cover in career development, whether it's career planning or job searching, networking, career exploration. You can always come up with those pieces, which I think really encourage the students to think about what they're going to do differently next time. So I think that's one of the most effective. I also really like the emotional piece that again, I think Tony maybe mentioned, looking at confidence, looking at levels of anxiety, looking at motivation. I think those are really impactful, because we know what we're trying to do is teach our students good skills to move forward. And if they're also challenging themselves around how their emotions are, and we're providing that challenge through our reflective question, that helps them progress along the way or identify where they need to work a little bit more. So, we have the regular, learning outcomes. Did you learn this? Did you learn that? But I think those other two kind of pushing students to action are really important as well.
Super. Thanks, Felicity. Tony.
Yeah, I think similar to what I think Felicity's already mentioned, and I think earlier in terms of my earlier spiel, when we look at beyond satisfaction, I think the biggest thing we're looking for is this shift. We sort of describe ourselves as career educators, but is anyone actually learning? Has anything changed as a result of the stuff we've done? So again, I think that's why we've been quite fans of the post-pre assessment, because it sort of allows us to get some feedback that we just weren't able to receive or get before. And also what's been really interesting with it is we've also been able to notice some differences in different types of students in terms of how they respond, which has also provided some interesting insights. So I think for us, again, that's big in terms of, again, seeing if there is some sort of shift in learning. And again, I think I talked about some of those proxies. One of the other things we've done in addition, I don't know exactly related to the question, is another technique we've done is just to get students' reactions. So again, with some of our programming, we'll just do something referred to as a minute essay, where we'll just give students index cards, and we'll say, you got 3 minutes. Tell us, as a result of participating in this session, what has changed for you? And if nothing's changed, say that too. It's anonymous. We don't need to know. And what we found from that is it's a really nice complement to the post-pre. Where post-pre, we get these sort of interesting numbers on shift. But then this is where, again, some of the emotion that Felicity was talking about. And because it's wide open, we're not prompting, it's not based on learning, we're just sort of seeing what's coming out. Are they going to mention some of the things we'd hoped would come out from our learning outcomes? And it's actually been amazing. We've been very surprised at how much students will share in those like 2 to 3 minute essays. And from there was initially a formative assessment just to see, okay, are we on track? Are we hitting points? But they've been so interesting, and some of the students have gone so deep that we've actually started to evaluate them, assess them for themes as well, and to see which themes are sort of popping through and how they align, again, with learning outcomes, and again, to some of these other measures that are important to the university.
Fantastic. Those are great ideas. Patsy.
Great. Thanks. So definitely want to echo what the other panelists have said around, students whether it's one-on-one appointment surveys or workshops, what is the knowledge they've acquired, asking them what they intend to apply. So assessing that learning. One of the things I want to share that maybe to take it on a little bit of a different angle is that not everything has to be an evaluation or a formal piece of paper. And I think some of the exercises that the panelists were speaking about is really getting to that is it doesn't always have to be a survey. And an example of something we did over this past year was we took our resume critique service that, we usually do critiques. It takes us 15 to 20 minutes. Students pick them up. It's a general service that we offer. It's developmental in nature. We feel it raises their awareness of where they're at and where they want to be. But what we weren't getting is how is it actually impacting them? So what we did was we partnered with our Student Success Center, and we did critiques face-to-face. So same amount of time. So operationally, it didn't cost us any more time. We just took what we did behind closed doors and did it face-to-face with students at our Student Success Center on the main floor of our campus. So what happened from that was all of our spots were filled. But we also got this very rich anecdotal feedback. So we had 16 spots, 16 spots got filled, and 16 times we heard face-to-face from students, thanks, that made a huge difference. I really found that valuable. It also gave us the opportunity to give them details about our services so they could come back for further feedback. So in that case, it connected to some of our strategic goals, like partnering with other areas at the university. It didn't change our operational commitment to the service, but it did give us a very rich amount of anecdotal feedback face-to-face from students. So the question is, do we really need to go back and do a formal survey to validate that, or does that verbal feedback really validate that it makes sense to maybe pilot this or actually apply this service consistently several times during the year? And so that's one of the learnings we've had throughout the years, just to try to gain insight in different ways from students, from employers, and possibly asking ourselves, do we need to make it a formal survey? When do we need to collect formal data? And when can we collect it in a different way?
Super. Thank you, Patsy. It's clear. So, I guess one of the issues that's come up in the past around evaluation is that sometimes people are afraid to do the evaluation because they don't want to see what the results are going to be. But it's clear that in this particular case with career services, that the results, when you ask students about the utility of using a particular service, are always very, very positive. So a number of times panelists spoke about collecting these data in order to meet needs of various stakeholders on campus tied to a strategic plan, and also demonstrate value. And so I think that folks who do engage in a regular evaluation exercise beyond the including volume and outcome or impact measures, have a good story to tell. So what are some effective strategies for telling your evaluation story to institutional stakeholders? And this time I'll start with Tony.
Thank you again there, Peter.
Welcome.
I would say, yeah, I think sharing the story is actually the critical part that we sometimes forget. And I know we're guilty of that as well here, because it's wonderful to collect stuff and do good work. But if no one knows you're doing good work, it's like the tree in a forest. Maybe not. Anyway, so just very simply making sure people know above you and then spreads it out. One of the ones that, probably the one technique that's been the most effective for us in sort of sharing the story is a use of infographics for our, especially for the volume and the demographic information. It's quick, it's easy, there's pretty colors. People seem to respond to that really well. And I remember one time we put together a summary where we sort of broke down some sort of key figures and statistics on some of our things we did, and again, our student breakdown, and we shared it with some senior admin, and they were so pleased with it. This is several years ago now, but it actually made it to our board of directors, which was shocking to us. So again, we thought it's not that time consuming, and again, there's technology that helps people do this. So I would say telling your story is, that's a really easy one, and it's kind of fun. And again, where there's opportunities at in departmental meetings, lunch and learns, whatever, places to get out and let people know the impact you're doing. And when we do that, whenever we share our volume data, we always try to then always also sneak in the sort of impact data as well, because they may not ask for the impact data initially. But again, this is some of that, the subversive power of evidence that Dr. Chris Magnuson refers to. So we try to sneak that in whenever we can, and I think that's been helpful. A final terms of strategy that some colleagues in co-op did that was very effective for a seasonal Christmas card a few years ago, where people used to send stuff out, and the movement went to e-cards. So they sent their e-card, but it was basically, hey, and here's what we've been doing. And they did all these infographics of sort of cool things that they've done into impact. And it was awesome. And I was so annoyed because I'm kind of a petty person and I wanted to take credit for that. But it was good. So.
Fantastic. Great ideas. Patsy, over to you.
Sure. So one of the strategies that we have tried that we think is telling our story better is to create maybe faculty-specific reports and summaries, because we do have, again, pretty good reporting when it comes to overall stats, overall numbers, but, at any post-secondary, there's a lot of, focus on how does it relate to our faculty, our students, and all those other elements. So what we've done is done some mini reports, very informal, sometimes just in an email, that basically summarize, okay, for our arts faculty, here's the number of students we saw, here's the number of workshops we did in class, here's the number of very specific employers that we had on campus or events that we did that were focused on the business students. And just by collating some of that data, it's starting to tell our story better to the faculty-specific group. We still need the overall story to be told, but that's one effective strategy at that level. At the department level, our operations coordinator, she really collects stories quarterly. So what we found is that at the end of the year, if somebody asks you, what did you do that made an impact? We all have a very hard time remembering. We're tracking stats, but are we really collecting those stories and are we remembering them? So quarterly, she's collecting those stories so that our reports now have more of that I guess you could say, that narrative approach that says, you know what, this many of our students were placed at this organization exclusively. One of our students received an award at their place of employment. That's quite common in our work experience cooperative education programs. So collecting information as you go throughout the year, beyond the statistics, has made a huge difference. The last thing we've done is, using stories that faculty in our university have already done of our students and grads. So if there's a story that's done of a student or grad that gets featured in our magazine, online on our website, or on a faculty website, with the approval of those areas, we simply relink that story on our main web page, and we run it as one of our rotating stories. And for us, what that's about is providing a service to them by retelling their story, but it's also showing the power of what our students are actually doing out there, what our grads are doing out there from a career and employment perspective. So there's so much time and energy that goes into some of these stories that are done. And I think all our universities have that. And just by simply relinking to some of those stories and blogs, it's sharing the overall message of the importance of career development and employment development in an academic setting.
Super. Thank you, Patsy. Felicity.
So thanks, Tony and Patsy. I've already jotted down some of your ideas to use myself, so this is great. I think, of course, I do agree with what you're saying, and just a couple of quick points to add. I think the idea of student stories is really important. We found that when you're especially when you're trying to explain career planning to somebody who's not really gone through a career planning process, can sound a bit vague, it can sound, not really clear to them. But if you can really tell the story of a student who's gone through the services that you offer and what they did and what your service did and how that helped them, what their outcome was, we found that to be really convincing, with especially our senior administrators. And you see the light bulb going off and they say, okay, that's what you guys are talking about. So individual stories shared with permission, of course, or non-identifying details is a really, really helpful thing we found. As well as Tony mentioned, the visuals, the infographics are good. And the point I would add to that is that we found if you produce those, you can often use them in a lot of different places. So it might seem like a lot of work, but if you do a nice infographic, you can present it to a department, to a student group, to whoever. You throw it up on your website because that helps as well. So we call them reusable objects, not my term, someone else's term, but I think that's a really helpful thing to do as well for telling your stories. And I think then just the other point, informal and formal, like wherever anybody gives you the opportunity, start telling your story. So if you have your assessment data in these kind of reusable objects, you can just pull it out whenever you need it. It's a really helpful thing to have, but it means thinking a little bit beforehand and getting yourself prepared.
Super, thanks, Felicity. And I guess, yeah, it sort of resonates with me, this notion of telling the stories. If you have an anecdote to tell, then that's very, very powerful. Over the years, I don't know how many data tables I've put onto overhead screens for people to look at and then told a story. Everybody forgets the data, but everybody remembers the story. So, and of one though, but anyway. So if we're measuring student use of services, this is just, again, coming back to the slide that we talked about before, leading into the fourth question, is that it's often the case that student affairs departments, if a budget comes to a crunch, then often people sort of start looking at student affairs as opposed to the academic side of the house. And so even if you have your volume measures available and you're promoting those across the campus, then people can say, well, I don't know, you've seen X number of students, is that good, bad, or indifferent? And so it becomes then a question of trying to estimate where your service delivery model is in terms of service use relative to some benchmark. And so I guess the question is, what effective strategies for benchmarking student use of services might be used? And so this time I'll start with Patsy.
Again, I think it depends on what the service is or what the intended outcomes are. But for example, on our work experience programs, we have 15 programs, 15 coordinators. They work with a cohort. It's a very high touch model. There's a significant amount of professional development that students get. So you know, we're looking at marketing efforts. For example, this past year, one of the benchmarks was, you know, there was a recession in Alberta, in Calgary, and it might not be relevant every year, but this year, reporting on the number of new employer partnerships we developed as a department, and specifically on our work experience cooperative education side, was a very important benchmark. How many students got placed, even how many jobs were posted for these students, and how many got placed within, you know, the unique economic scenario that we're in right now, was a very important measure to tell that story. Our career fair had, you know, 1,500 job vacancies reported by those that were attending. So as far as effective strategies, I think part of it is to be flexible with what you're reporting, because it can change year to year or season by season, and it might not be the same, you know, overall. You have to have that flexibility in looking at what's really going on. You know, obviously we record statistics and benchmark use of all of our services. One other thing we did this year was we really looked at, statistically, we only have 2 full-time career development professionals on our general side. And if that resource is not going to change, we looked at how many one-on-one appointments they can see, how many resume critiques they do, how many attendees we get at our workshops, at our in-class workshops, and we added all that up. And we really came out with a number that's about, we can only ever reach about 20% of our students with existing services. So that's kind of our benchmark. But what that led to is looking at an online career and employment platform that can maybe help reach that other 80%, or looking at some other strategies that we can use, different partnership strategies to use that 80%. So in that case, we use benchmarking to come to terms with some realities around our service and look at new and different service delivery models, because the resources might stay the same. So I think the benchmarking is more about the operational and strategic outcomes that you need to achieve as a program or as a department, and then aligning what you're looking at, you know, to kind of inform some of the decisions you need to make.
Thank you, Patsy. Felicity.
I think Patsy's covered a lot of the important parts there. The one thing I would say in terms of volume, one benchmark that our student fee funders have asked us for is unique numbers of students using our service. So wanting to know overall how many UTM students use the service each year. So that took a little bit of work to, you know, pull all of that together, because basically you're taking every attendance list and registration and times that they've logged into the website, putting it all together, and then taking all the duplicates out to find out how many students actually use the service each year. That might seem like a really basic stat, but it's one that really for our funders has been important, because they want to know, we're putting this money into your service. Are you attracting enough of us to come and justify the cost? And that has worked well for us, because the figure has been fairly good over the last, I think, 6 or 7 years that we've done it. So I think that speaks to what Patsy was saying, in that you're looking at the situation. What do people want and need to know that will help you advance your case in the institution? What will help your staff understand the value of what they're doing, what we're doing well, and how to improve? And those are the kinds of benchmarks that I think we look for along the way, but it can change from year to year, although I'll say that uniques number, that's consistent since we started doing it. And to be honest, they asked for it for a few years before. It took us a little while to be able to figure out how to do it properly and accurately. So that is a good one for us.
Okay, super. Thanks, Felicity. Tony.
Yeah, even though, yeah, I think we're told to be careful about echoes and these sorts of things. I will echo a lot of what my colleague said. That's my attempt at being clever. It is Friday morning here. You're not going to get much better than that. Yeah, I think similar to things been discussed earlier in terms of benchmark, the key is start. You're never going to have something to benchmark if you don't do that first year. And just like we tell our students, it's okay to fail. You know, we learn from that. You know, you can start, and it's not going to be perfect, but starting is useful. And I'll share. We've been collecting statistics and doing some of these really cool infographics for a couple of years. And then we actually had someone from one of the business analysts from Student Services offer to give us some assistance to actually do things better and more efficiently. We're quite excited, and we're quite proud of what we showed them. And then shortly after, a few weeks after analyzing some of our stuff and helping us move forward, he gave us the news that we were double counting a whole bunch of students. So we had inflated, so we thought we were being so cool. But you know, you have to start, and these are the things that are going to happen, and you know, and the world didn't stop revolving upon that realization. The trends were still the trends, so we just had to scale back and correct it for the next time. So even that, where we made a pretty major public error, it didn't really impact us negatively. And I think, again, senior admin were still largely appreciative that we were sort of engaging in this process. So so I'm happy to share our warts, because you know it's part of it, and it's part of the growing that occurs. The other thing that we found was useful for us is to be very specific with our categories. We used to do a real sort of lump sum in terms of how we reach students. Where just every contact was just this one big number that got included, and it really became a meaningless number. So we really it became important to us to sort of separate and define what do we mean by, you know, one-to-one appointments, workshops that we run, workshops that we do embedded in partnership activities, other career events, etc. And then, you know, look for trends and stuff and patterns within those groups and collectively when it makes sense, but don't artificially put stuff together. For example, we run a large fair every year. We run a few. We plop in the middle of a busy hallway. So counting usage or number of students impacted is virtually impossible, but we'd have some various estimates, but to include that in our totals just made no sense. So again, so that's one of the things we did. Last thing in terms of, I agree with the point on individual students. Big thing for us were wait times and no-shows. The wait times had quite a significant impact with our senior admin, because we had a couple of periods where it could be 4 weeks before somebody could see us, which was really outside our standard of what we thought was acceptable. And in combination with some of the demographic information we had, particularly around international students, we had a very high usage at a time where the university was looking at that. We were able to the combination of those two made it possible to get some additional staffing resources. So again, sometimes it shares our stories, but it helps when make our case for resources when we need them.
Super, thanks, Tony. We're coming toward the end. We have about 5 minutes left. There was one last question that had to do with the ROI, return on investment, and when we surveyed folks, basically nobody said they were doing that. They basically said, this is really, really difficult. We haven't got a clue how to do it. And even if we did, how do you control for the various extraneous variables that may have an impact on ROI? So very quickly, in terms of our panelists, any thoughts on this issue of ROI? It's clearly problematic. Let's start with Tony.
Let's see, I think I misunderstood the question. I thought it had something to do with French royalty. So I didn't see the connection.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. I think it's harder to claim return on investment on some of the longer term things that we're trying to do, because of all the variables that impact people's employment career success. I think on sort of smaller things, short in terms of shift, in terms of appointment no-shows, in terms of volume, number of students who we see, I think the return on investment is a little easier to calculate. I don't know how compelling an argument that is internally yet. So I think that's all I'll say on that.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Yes, Felicity?
Yeah, it is a really hard one. The only thing I would add to Tony's answer is you could also calculate kind of the breadth and depth of the kind of program you're doing to show that you're really serving a broad spectrum of people and interests and ideas. But otherwise, no, that is a really hard one. Maybe that's a great session at Connexus if somebody wants to come up with how to do that.
Thanks, Felicity. How about you, Patsy?
I would agree. You know, we went into this profession maybe because we wanted to avoid analytics and statistics and all that kind of stuff. So it's difficult to put measures on development, and that's the whole nature of career development, is that it is a process, and it's very internal for a lot of people. And a lot of us as career centers, we don't want to be known as just job shops. So we are asked, did all the activities that you do actually help someone find a job? Possibly, but there, like everyone else said, there's so many different factors, and that could have also contributed to that. Are they more happy with their program and with their opinion of our institution? Possibly, but it's very difficult to trace those. So I think, those are one of the few reasons why it's daunting. But on that note, I think if you can measure something as far as the operational benefits of it, some things that career centers do are revenue generating as well. Some things build partnerships with faculty. So I think return on investment at a career services level can't just be numbers based. It probably has to be a combination of factors and variables that we could all, maybe even a matrix. So again, maybe that is a great topic, as Felicity said, that someone could create and develop, where we could measure the type of return on investment that we're getting. It's not going to be a standalone process for everybody or every program or every institution. But I think we maybe should not think that maybe it doesn't matter at all. It's just hard to achieve it.
Yeah, thanks, Patsy. The reason I said, is it possible or even desirable, it seems to me that based on, the comments that we've heard today and what we heard in our interviews across Canada, was that if you can show that you're meeting the needs of the various campus stakeholders and you're demonstrating the value of the service, it's almost irrelevant to look at ROI. I mean, if you're helping people and you're meeting their needs and they're happy and see the value of what you're doing, then calculating some number maybe is less relevant. So I'm going to end with this slide, and then we'll ask for questions. It's the slide I ended with on Monday, so we're coming full circle with the last slide for Friday, which shows the 7 characteristics of the impressive career service model in post-secondary education. So I'll turn it over to Sharon for questions from the online audience. Sharon?
All right, we do have quite a few questions, but our time is short, so maybe I will ask one to all the panelists for their comment. And a lot of the other questions have to do with specific tactics, processes at each of your institutions related to evaluation. So what we'll do is share those questions with all of you and then ask if you can follow up directly with the individuals who were inquiring. So one question for everyone, and that's Tracy, who wants to know, she works with the Alberta government, and wants to know if you think that there's anything that governments could do to support universities with measuring or evaluating their post-secondary career services.
Anybody on the panel?
Well, I imagine if something was tied to funding, if there were some sort of incentives in that regard, I think that would be okay, I'll take a step back. I think one of the challenges we see with our students in terms of transition is they have great skills that they developed in their studies, but they haven't necessarily taken that sort of reflective thought that we often refer to as career development to actually sort of analyze, why am I in this program? What can I do with it? What do I want to be? And how can I use my time effectively? And what strategies can I put in place? There's no place where you have to do that. You don't really get that in the K-12. There's nowhere you have to do that. You just have to take your whatever credits and you're out. So finding a way to incentivize institutions to build that into the programming somewhere so the students are involved in that sort of process that I think we would all agree would be valuable. And then putting in the evaluation component with that, I think would be immensely helpful.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and with that, Peter, maybe I'll ask you for some closing remarks since we're at our time.
Okay, well, again, as every other day, I'd like to thank the panelists for taking the time from what I know is a very, very busy schedule to join us on this webinar. It's been immensely enjoyable for me every day this week, and I'm hoping that the audience has gained over the 5 days some very useful information, tips, and ideas of how to move forward with their services. Thanks, everyone.
So this brings us to the end of our series. Thank you so much, Patsy, Tony, and Felicity, for sharing your insights today. And thank you, Peter, for moderating our panels throughout what has been a fantastic week of learning. Everyone can watch for an email this afternoon with all the slides and recordings from the week. And as mentioned, we will also be sending out a short evaluation form as well, and would greatly value your feedback. And if you want to learn even more, if that's possible, and I think it is possible, about this impressive career service research, then I invite you to join us at the Connexus National Career Development Conference, which has been mentioned a few times on the webinar today, and that's happening in Ottawa in January. And as you'll see on your screen, Peter will be presenting, as will several of the panelists. And I wanted to remind you that, of course, you can download both the PSE report and reference guide on the CEREC website, and that's at cerec.ca/PSE. Finally, let me close by thanking all of you for participating on the webinar. And with that, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.